Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. I like having him on every 3 or 4 months to give us his thoughts on the global economy. He's the editor of the Hat Trick Letter at goldenjackass.com. Jim Willie, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, it's a pleasure being back, Jason. As usual, events are fast moving.
Oh, there's so much current events going on right now, and as usual, the U.S. mainstream financial media isn't covering any of them. I think you've been talking about for years that the Chinese have, this supersonic missile to blow up aircraft carriers. I think I just saw it in Bloomberg last week, so it shows you how far behind the U.S. mainstream media is.
Yeah, well, the Russians have a supersonic torpedo. Can you figure that out? It goes 700 miles an hour underwater.
I'm sure we'll find out about that. I'm sure the U.S. mainstream media will release that years from now. But I want to get into my first question. Recently, there was a secret meeting between Russia and a Saudi prince. Was the meeting about a coordinated oil production cut to move the price higher to save the world's largest oil-producing countries, or did it have something to do about Syria and its pipelines, or was there a mix of these type of things involved in this meeting?
I actually think the most important topic during that discussion was Putin telling the Saudis to quit supporting ISIS. Very plain. You quit supporting ISIS, or you Saudi royals are going to get killed. That's what I think he told them. Not only that, but I think it was a general message that we're going to be working with the Gulf Emirates, the Russians were saying, work with the Gulf Emirates in order to better control the oil price. In other words, do away with OPEC and come up with something better. I think it's going to be the Gulf Emirates, Iran, and Russia together, forming a new cartel, but a more constructive cartel. And the first act, indeed, might be something very unusual, where the Emirates, when I say Emirates, I mean Saudi, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, the nations that have no democracy. They're basically royal dictatorships and fascist rules under Islam, lunatic crap, where they behead people for violations, they cut their hands off for stealing something, but when their princes get caught for moving heroin through the Beirut airport, they get a pass. So I think the Russians were telling the Saudis, get your act together because we don't approve of you supporting with funds and weapons. And the funds are through narcotics. The ISIS guerrillas that the United States, British, and Israeli intelligence have organized. That's ISIS. The irony in there is that ISIS, Islamic State, Independent for Syria, something like that. I can't remember. Iraqi State for Independence in Syria. It has the same acronym as the Israeli Security, Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. So, they want to change that to ISIL, the L being for Levant, which is a region that covers Iraq and Syria and part of Lebanon. Okay, the other motives were clearly, in my opinion, to start limiting output and allowing Iran back into the game. Just quit your fighting, you idiot Muslims with your Sunni conservatives and your radical Shiites. The Saudis have some very serious problems, but we'll get to that in a minute. I don't know how successful they're going to be in having the Emirates slow down some of their output so that the Iranians can sell. They're talking about 500,000 barrels in November per day from Iran. And in 3 months, another 500,000 to make 1 full million new barrels a day. I think if we don't get Gulf Emirate cooperation, we're going to see some significant impacts and bank system craters from hitting $30 oil. And we may get it anyway from the slowing economy, because you can talk all you want about a sluggish recovery and a very low growth global economy. The truth is the U.S. has a minus 4% recession and has for 7 consecutive years. The truth is that Western Europe now is in recession, and even Germany is struggling to avoid recession. I think they might have a slight recession. So that's what I think is going on. And if you saw the picture of Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince under King Salman, who's senile and has stepped aside, they call him MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. MBS had a picture with Putin. And the body language was loud. It was like the, not the warden, but the school principal calling in a naughty kid, sitting at the table, sitting in a chair next to the principal, where the principal is basically giving him a tongue lashing. What the hell are you doing? Supporting ISIS. So that's what I think's going on.
Putin's been tongue-lashing Western journalists, too, from Western Europe and also the United States, who ask him questions and don't really, they just repeat the mainstream line. It's funny seeing Putin's speeches and subtitles when he's doing question and answer sessions with journalists. I don't know if you've seen those, but those are pretty hilarious. Him explaining, do you even know what's really going on and all these things like that.
Yeah. Do you have any common sense? He asked an elderly, not too old, looked like a 65-year-old press journalist, veteran in London. Do you have any idea what's going on? Do you have any common sense? The guy was basically calling Putin aggressive in Ukraine. I mean, it's just ridiculous crap, as you say, parroting what my colleagues have called the official narrative. The official narrative is a bunch of crap. It's a bunch of just total nonsense that a lot of smart people in the United States have actually embraced. I like to point to my brother and my father. They're smart, educated people. My brother said to me 6 months ago during a visit, Jeanette, Putin's a prick. I said, do you know anything about him? And he said, well, yeah, So I rattled off 10 different things about Putin. He said, no, I don't know anything about them. I said, then maybe you shouldn't really have a strong opinion, John, because you don't know anything. Well, I read a lot. I said, what do you read besides the New York Times? Well, not much.
Well, that's the narrative, Jim. I mean, look at the debates from both political parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. Some of the main questions all the candidates are being offered is what to do about Putin. So he seems to be, the new bad guy, the flavor of the month. Gaddafi in the past and Saddam in the past, and I guess Putin's the new bad guy now, who the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, those types, they have their people in Fox News, on CNN, in the New York Times. They want to spread this message that Putin's evil, anything he does is bad, and it hurts America and all this stuff.
Yeah, well, pretty soon I think there's going to be a wake-up call that Putin's main mission is to do away with the dollar. I call it the King Dollar Reign of Terror. And that's his offense. He does not want the dollar in his system. Take a look back and what happened a year or two before the Ukraine war began, and Putin booted out the Rothschild bankers. This is all a follow-on effect of booting out the big, ugly, Western corrupt bankers who, take a look farther back and you see that the same Rothschild family was involved in funding the Bolsheviks. I'm talking about funding the Soviet-Russian Revolution, funding Trotsky, hiring Lenin, the ideologues, the practical leaders, stealing their gold. They convinced the Tsar of Russia to move the gold to France and other points in Europe, the United States even. They never got it back. In other words, the Rothschild bankers created the Soviet Union after stealing all their gold. Naturally, the Russians are pissed off. Putin knows all about it. And that's the kind of stuff that people like my brother have no idea. They go, oh, really? Well, I don't follow that. Well, John, you're missing the main point. You're missing the motive for murder. the cause for war. This is it. He said, well, I don't know. Maybe I need to read up more on that. But he doesn't. And most Americans don't. It's so much easier to take a spoonful per day of the American Western news bullshit.
Yeah, it's heavily sugar-coated, and most Americans don't, even ones who have history degrees, they don't understand both sides of the story and history. They just, I was a history major in college, and, most of the people I studied with, they just repeated verbatim everything that was in, the government textbooks. And that's, I guess, how most of history is written. It's written by the victors on whatever perspective they want. People don't look at the other perspectives, but these people in other countries, like Putin and so many others, they understand kind of what the other side of the story and what actually happened to them.
Yeah, I asked The Voice, this is a very appropriate theme. I asked The Voice, what do you suppose I'll be doing in 5 years after the gold standard is back? And maybe the hat-trick letter doesn't have a lot of relevance because, well, there's not a whole lot of conflict, and we have the gold standard, and now it's a matter of rebuilding the economies, and the banks are recapitalized with gold. What do you suppose I might be doing? And he said, you might be writing a history book. The jackass might be writing a couple chapters in a history book. Yeah. I'm game. All right, let's move on.
My next question has to do with the IMF. It is said Saudi Arabia can only survive at most 5 years of low oil prices at their current burn rate in foreign exchange reserves before they go bankrupt too. Almost every other OPEC producer has spent most of their oil profits almost as soon as the profits come in and are in much worse shape than the Saudis are. Will OPEC be going to China begging for a bailout if oil prices don't rise again soon?
Well, yeah, I think this is going to be, it's going to be coming, I think, very interesting real soon when two things will be happening. The first is that the Gulf Emirates, led by the Saudis, are going to sell the Chinese oil in RMB. But then I think something else is going to happen. The Chinese are going to help to cover. It's basically to replace the capital costs, the business costs, the business investment. What's Saudi Arabia going to do, say, with all of their plant and equipment for Aramco? If they're not making money, are they going to maybe mortgage out their capital for Aramco and the petrochemical complex? So I think what we're going to see is RMB is going to be used for oil sales to China and maybe other parts in Asia. RMB is going to be used to cover debt in Saudi Arabian government bonds. RMB is going to be used perhaps for business loans against the vast petrochemical complex in Saudi Arabia that will want to borrow money on, basic commercial loans and terms and maybe some Aramco bonds or whatever, basic loans or bonds. We're going to start seeing RMB used for oil sales and capitalization of the entire global oil industry, the next spot like Venezuela. Okay, so this is going to be very, very interesting. The Saudis, they've got a budget problem. And I think one of the motives for the Yemen war is to steal the Yemen oil reserves. They don't talk about that in the Western press because that's not noble. It's a lot better to say there are a lot of Islamic terrorists in Yemen. That's for the morons in the crowd who make up the majority in the U.S. Unfortunately, I'm not among them. I looked for what the real motive was in Yemen, and I learned that being a southern neighbor on the same peninsula, Yemen is owner of gigantic oil reserves that are untapped. Okay, the Saudis have other big problems. They're being surrounded. To their east, there's Iran, and that used to be known as the Persian Empire. And they've been really quiet for 30 years, kind of like Russia was quiet for 80 years and then woke up. Well, guess what? Persia's going to wake up. Persia's got a control in Lebanon. They've got some control in Iraq. And if you look at the integrated relationships that Iran has in the whole Arab world, you see a significant presence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, even Kurdistan. So, to the Saudis' north, there's a lot of Iran. To Saudis' south, there's a lot of Iran working with the Yemenis. And it gets even worse. On the western edge, not edge so much, the western side, the western portion of Saudi Arabia, there are a lot of Shiites. And they're more loyal to Iran than they are to the Saudi royals, who treat them like garbage. So, Saudi Arabia could be imploding right into Riyadh, surrounded on all sides. Going to get interesting. Iran is surrounding. I think we have a new Russia-Iran axis forming. And part of the reason for the meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, with Putin, was to tell him, look, we've got this Persian-Russian axis. You could be knocked over on your ass by it, or you can join it. What'll it be? And Putin's talking to this inexperienced 32-year-old kid who's got a hobby of the Yemen war. And they're bombing hospitals, they're bombing schools, they're doing exactly what the Americans are doing in Syria. Bombing bridges, marketplaces, schools, hospitals. It's called war crimes. The U.S. does it all the time, and we call it fighting terrorism. So, the Saudis have some very big problems. I think, if I had to sum it up, I'd say the Western elite have a real big backfire at work, because the Saudi empire, the Saudi royal house, the House of Saud, it's all caving in.
Yeah, Jim, and the mainstream believes that, the Saudis have almost unlimited amounts of oil, but we know from the WikiLeaks documents that came out, I think the first round with Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, that there were in the cables from embassies that, the Saudis have rapidly depleting wells and things like that. So it wouldn't surprise me then that the Saudis are looking for more sources of oil revenue and to replenish reserves and things like that. But it's just not being reported in the mainstream. But it seems that, the Saudis and OPEC's plan, whether, they were combining with Wall Street or they were combining with Russia or whoever, it seems like the plan was to, lower oil prices to a certain level and try to bankrupt the shale oil companies, but that seems to have backfired too.
Everything the U.S. and apparently the Saudis have done has backfired. The Iran sanctions have backfired, the Arab Spring has backfired, ISIS has backfired, and now the lower oil price to wreck Russia, that has backfired. When Russia has 25,000 tons of gold, they've got a pretty significant war chest to weather the tough times. The Saudis don't. Unfortunately, the Saudis saw most of their gold stolen in Switzerland, and that's what Credit Suisse and UBS was all about. The U.S. came up with charges, and then they took over control of UBS, and they opened the vaults and stole the Arab gold. And they came up with other charges against Credit Suisse, opened the vaults after taking control, and all the Arab gold was stolen. So the Saudis don't have anything. All they've got is a bunch of Spanish and Los Angeles property, a lot of yachts. And The Voice made a comment last week that took me a little off guard. He said, a lot of foreign assets owned by the Saudi royals are going to get confiscated and liquidated. And I'm wondering exactly by who, but, that's a discussion for another day. Let me point out something regarding the Saudi depleted reserves. One of the guys on my team, he knows who he is, if he's listening to this. I've got a team of about 8 colleagues. They're all smart as hell. Not much gets missed by us. And they're really responsible for one notch of depth and quality for the hat-trick letter. Well, this guy wrote me back in 2007. I mean, he's been on my team a long time. I met him back in 2005, and we joined up. And he wrote me and said, take a look at this, Jim. It's the oil drum. It's a website. It's very technical. It's got a lot of geologic engineering, petroleum engineering, seismic stuff. But he said, take a look at this one little article within it, one story within it. And it was about the water cut of Gawar. Gawar is the largest oil field in the world, and it's rapidly getting depleted. And I think it's majority depleted right now. But he said evidence of the depletion comes in the water cut. And for Gawar oil field, it was 95% water that they were bringing up and only 5% oil from the Gawar field in 2007. And an update that I heard a few months ago was that it was up to 98%. So they're only getting 2% oil out of their biggest oil field. But they've got several oil fields. Now here's where the irony comes in. The other oil fields in Saudi Arabia, besides Gawar, are mostly on the western side of Saudi Arabia that is under Shiite control and pays a lot more attention to Iran than Riyadh. So if there's some real big problems in Saudi Arabia and they have trouble keeping control of all of their elements, their regions, they might actually lose control of their richest and most abundant oil production in the western provinces of Saudi Arabia that might follow Iranian orders a little bit more. So this is going to get very weird, very dicey, very fast for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, there's so much behind the scenes that goes on in the oil market. I mean, the oil market is such a large market. Most countries are dependent on oil either to consume it or produce it and make a lot of money off of it. My next question is also about oil. We've seen on Zero Hedge articles about this. Some Wall Street commodity traders are whether it's Wall Street commodity traders or someone else, are illegally buying $10 a barrel oil on the black market from ISIS. Why haven't the buyers gotten caught when it would seem to almost anyone pretty easy for the U.S. government to be able to track the trucks with satellites or, or Israel or any of these other people who have satellites or boots on the ground to check to see who's moving the oil?
There's no law on Wall Street.
That's not surprising. I guess if there's a buck to be made, right, I guess they don't care about the law.
Well, let's look at some of the illegal things that have been going on. To begin with, one of ISIS's customers is the Turkish government. Do you find that strange?
That's NATO, right? So Turkey's a puppet of Turkey's controlled by NATO being told what to do?
Well, yeah, that's kind of proof that NATO is behind ISIS if they're buying ISIS oil. But really, I follow things like, not accounts and locations and countries and individuals and mules. I follow generally the narco money laundering and what kind of commitment the money launderers have. And what I've found in the last few years, and this goes back to 2005, 6, 7, Bank of America and Citigroup are heavily involved as in their core in narcotics money laundering. Bank of America and Citigroup. Okay, then I came to learn that about 15% of it's a cut of 15% for narco money laundering movements. Okay. Then there was a case of Wachovia being caught with Mexican narco traffickers, and I looked to see and calculated what the percentage of the fine was, and it was 0.3%. Well, I think that's a pretty good cost of business, don't you? So narco money laundering is responsible I should say, whatever they move, they get 15% profit on. So if they're not making money in commercial loans, they're sure as hell making a lot of money in narco money laundering. But, the Wall Street banks have really never been brought to justice for all the mortgage bond fraud. I mean, there's $280 billion worth of penalties and fines and whatever for multiple years of criminal activity in bond fraud, and not a single felony has been charged, and not a single person has gone to jail. Of course, a lot of guys have been tossed out of windows, but I think that has to do with hiding the J.P. Morgan, what's the name of the guy? Bruno Ixel, the London whale. They didn't want it to be known that that was really a $100 billion loss, not $8. So the people who knew that it was $100 billion, they were thrown out of windows. But there were some others that were thrown out of windows because J.P. Morgan lost some Russian mafia investments. But then you had other, besides the mortgage bond fraud in Wall Street, you had the MERS title database that allowed them to sell multiple times one particular mortgage on multiple different mortgage bonds. So, I don't need to justify or really even resolve criminal activity in Wall Street. It's been going on a long time. There's no law in Wall Street. It's part of the fascist business model, Jason. I mean, when you had the Patriot Act and 9/11 and all that, I started promoting the concept, not as a good thing, but as a terrible thing that would result eventually in the collapse of the United States and its economy and financial structures. I started promoting the concept of the fascist business model, where the big corporations become really part and parcel of the U.S. government, like, for instance, Goldman Sachs running the Department of Treasury, like, for instance, J.P. Morgan acting as agent for the Federal Reserve, and the big pharmaceutical companies working closely with the military to devise laced vaccines that kill people, and, GMO foods with Monsanto, Halliburton with its fracking of oil. All these are criminal corporations, many of which are satanic, and they really run the U.S. and the policy. Now take a look at the financial regulatory bill. It was proposed by Ron Paul and a bunch of good people. Before you know it, Citigroup and Goldman Sachs were writing the whole thing. And making concessions, but there's no law in Wall Street. We're now looking at the climax of the fascist business model that was fully embraced after 2001. So here we are 14 years later, and we're looking at a systemic failure, economic collapse, annual 4%, 5% recession. We're looking at a treasury bond supported by $1 trillion per month in hidden QE. It covers a lot of things besides the treasury bonds. We get breakdown all over the place. This is the climax of the fascist business model. So if Wall Street's buying ISIS oil, hey, fine. I don't give a crap. It's all breaking down. It's all collapsing. This is, the Roman Empire, and Obama is Nero. This is game over.
In our last interview, you talked about a massive oil bust that was coming, and we've seen that the last 12 months. So I definitely think you correctly predicted that. But why haven't we seen banks go bust from shale oil loans yet? Is the Federal Reserve secretly bailing these banks out?
Yeah, but more importantly, the banks who are on the hook are issuing patch loans. Let me give you an example. Let me just make up the name, Baker Hughes. Suppose Baker Hughes has got a $3 billion loan with Citigroup, and it's got a payment due of $50 million next month, and they can't make it. So Citigroup gives them another loan for $50 million. This is not complicated. It's like, borrowing money from one credit card company to pay off your other credit card company, except it's all the same company, Citigroup. So the big banks are saying, look, we don't want you to default. We don't want you to even make an admission that your covenants, your loan covenants are in violation, meaning that they're not making sufficient profit on a monthly basis from certain projects. So instead of allowing them to fail, they say, well, we'll lend you the next payment. Okay, well, you don't default when your lender lends you the next payment. I mean, it'd be nice if my MasterCard bank, let's call it Bank X, Bank X says, Jim, you've got a big payment coming up of $1,100 next month. And I say, well, I can't really pay it. I only have half that. And they said, well, that's okay. We'll pay it for you, and we'll add it to your line of credit. We'll add it to your loan balance. Okay, well, it's not complicated. So I think the banks are feverishly working to prevent loan covenant violations, and the big banks and the big energy firms, they're on the hook together. If you take a look at the failures to deliver on Treasury bonds, it's $40 billion a day, multiplied by roughly 25 days, working days per month. You got $1 trillion. Maybe the volume's down a little bit, as you were saying before the interview, but I'm still assuming that we've got the lion's share, the majority of $1 trillion a month in hidden QE. That covers a lot of loans. It also covers a lot of banks doing their hedging operations for the oil industry. So I think the Fed is covering some of this, Jason, but I think the majority of covering the loans is from the banks who are at risk. They don't want to say, Baker Hughes, you've defaulted. We're going to have to come seize some of your properties, your equipment. We don't want to do that. We're not in the business of doing secondhand sales of drilling equipment. We don't want to lay off all those guys. We want to hope, and this is the stupidity and hopeaholics, we're going to hope that the oil price comes back soon so that we don't have to do this again next month. But after the big banks get tired of month after month after month of covering the necessary debt service, they're going to continue. When they get really tired of it, they'll stop, and then they'll have to say, Baker Hughes, we're going to have to declare you in violation. You got a debt default, and that's just the way it is. And if Baker Hughes has to go down the tubes, then that's the way it is. And if they get bought out by the Chinese, that's the way it is. So the banks have a motive not only to prevent their own bank from suffering a large partner's default, they don't want the Chinese banks to come in and take over these businesses and industries. And they will. So that's what I think's going on.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the Chinese banks, Jim, because I was actually going through the financials of Petrobras, which is one of the largest, one of the larger oil producers. It's, partnership between the government of Brazil and private. And, I was reading through their financials a number of months ago, and they were saying how basically, they have to sell $60 billion worth of assets as soon as possible to get cash. They have an enormous amount of debt. They didn't anticipate, having this low cash flow and profits and things like that. And then they were talking there about how they're going to need a bailout from Chinese and Asian banks. So the management team actually wrote that in their financials. I was shocked to see it in there. So I guess they're going to be going hand in hand to the Chinese and other Asian banks for a bailout in exchange for a large amount of oil.
Yeah, well, there are a couple things to comment there. The Brazilian oil deposits, they're not easy. I mean, when I say Brazil, I don't call it Petrobras. It's the major player in Brazil. They call them the salts, and it might have a deeper name, a fuller name, but I just call it the salts. What it means is it's buried under the sea, under salt deposits. And it's not right off the coast 3 miles. It's 200 miles off the Brazilian coast. These are not easy properties and deposits to exploit and produce from. It's part of the reason why Petrobras is stuck. They're going to blame it on the oil price, but it's really two things besides that. They're difficult deposits to exploit in an industrial way, commercial way. But the second thing is, and this goes, very much in sync, in rhyming terms with what Venezuela did. They basically wrecked their national oil company by putting in non-engineers at critical spots, like engineering spots. They put somebody's friend rather than an engineer with expertise. And there were a lot of loans given out to the buddies of the executives running the corporation. Whether it's Venezuela or Brazil, it's largely the same story. Incompetent people in positions of authority within the engineering firm and a lot of loans. sweetheart loans given to the cronies. So if you take a look at the entire set of debt for Petrobras, I would not be surprised if, say, 10 to 25% of it was actually sweetheart corrupt loans that they'll never see again. And they're going to blame it on the oil price. Now, China's going to come in there. Bear in mind that on the Brazilian shipping pier, the biggest pier in the world, it extends 3 miles, and the Chinese built it. It's off the Brazilian coast. I don't know exactly what city it's next to, but it's a gigantic shipping pier. The Chinese are already there. The Chinese-Brazil yuan swap agreement was the first one. It was the model. It was the prototype. The Chinese are already there. Brazil was invited to be a BRICS nation. B as in Brazil. But of all the BRICS nations, Brazil is the one that's hurting the most. And, you know, they talk about infrastructure investment by the BRICS Bank. They might want to start looking at reforming, not bailing out, but reforming Brazil. Because it's a basket case. And it has to do with difficult deposits and a lot of bribery and loans. I mentioned the loans, the sweetheart loan, but there's a lot of bribery to, you know, get things approved and, you know, overcome certain standards that weren't met. But it's very complicated.
Yeah, look at all the wasted construction money on the World Cup. They have, you know, white elephant stadiums around the rainforest, and they've had collapses there prior to the World Cup. Now they have the Olympics coming up soon. A lot of those deals were arranged, you know, on no bids, cronyism, and things like that. So it's not really going to help. Those events are not really going to help the economy, especially with the low commodity prices. I mean, it's just going to be onerous debt that that won't help out the Brazilian people really.
No, there's a lot of weird things that happen in preparation for the World Cup, followed by the Olympics. I hope the Olympics go off well. They probably will. But I've got some friends who go down to Colombia, and I've got a couple friends who've gone to Brazil. And they come back and they tell their stories. And one of the stories they tell about Rio de Janeiro is they emptied out all the brothels, all the bordellos, all the whorehouses. They got rid of them all in the city. And they told them, you must operate, if you wish to continue, you must operate outside the city limits. Because we don't want you here during the World Cup. Oh, my goodness. Yeah, okay. Well, they fixed that.
Yeah, they fixed it. They just moved it to someone else's jurisdiction, and they didn't fix it at all.
Well, what
they
it
just
means,
moved it.
and let's get practical here. We're talking about single mothers making a living and single women making a living where maybe few opportunities exist. They're gone in Rio. How's that going to affect the economy? They're gone.
Crime's going to go up.
They're going to resort to selling cocaine.
Yep.
Okay.
And with you know low commodity prices, Brazil was so dependent on exporting commodities to China or other countries. That's gone too, and now you know the crime was, I heard, pretty high in Brazil, but I'm sure it's going to spike even more now.
Oh yeah, when the economy goes down, the crime rises. All right, well let's move on. I wanted to add that about Petrobras because I just did a story in the November Hattrick led a report on that, so it was fresh in my mind. All right.
Okay, my next question is about Christine Lagarde. She's had some controversial comments come out. She's a head of the IMF, for our listeners who are not familiar. She seems to approve of the RMB going into the SDR very soon, which is a special drawing right. But the U.S. government appears committed to blocking the RMB into the SDR for at least a while longer. How much longer can the U.S. government block the RMB going into the SDR?
I don't know. How many more months do you think the U.S. government is going to tolerate $100 billion in Chinese sales of treasuries? I mean, you take a look at why the IMF is turning around on its decision. I point to two things. August, September, October timeframe, China dumped $250 billion in treasury bonds. If that's not a warning across the USS dollar bow, I don't know what is. Okay, the other thing the Chinese did was they said, okay, well, what are your requirements for IMF inclusion? And the IMF came back with a certain accounting standards. I don't have the exact name for it, but I think it was SDDS or DSS. I think it was SDDS. I don't know what it stands for. But anyway, it was an international standards for accounting, and China just conformed a few weeks ago. Okay, well, they did so in order to remove an obstacle for the IMF inclusion. The Chinese didn't stop there. They came out with a rudimentary, I mean, it's not full-fledged, fully operating, multifaceted yet, but they came out with a competitor to the SWIFT banking system. And from what I'm hearing, the voice told me, this is slick, and it's a little bit easier to use, and it's a little bit more, it's got a couple of steps, got about 3 steps to it. It's basically a certain special credit card swipe as one step. It's a screen operation submission on another step, and bang, $100,000 just moved from A to B, and it did not go through the Federal Reserve. So the Chinese International Payment System, CIP, I wish they'd call it CHIP. They're calling it the CHIPS, but it's the CIPS. That rocked the Western banker elite in their home. Okay, so we're going to see the RMB inclusion very soon, and what I'm finding is that only 2 or 3 financial analysts in the entire West, and I'm really not even sure that they're from the West. I think one was from Standard Chartered in Hong Kong, but 2 analysts came out with estimates that if the Chinese RMB joins the dollar, pound, euro, yen in the special drawing rights, there would be an immediate consequence that would have to be fulfilled in the next several months because of practicalities. The global banking system, by that I mean South Korea's banks, France's banks, Sweden's banks, UAE banks, they would all have to start buying up in order to meet the quota, meet percentage requirements. They're going to be guidelines. They're not going to be strict. But they're going to have to buy up what is estimated to be about $1 trillion worth of RMB government bonds from China. Now, if the global banking system has to buy $1 trillion worth of RMB bonds, do you think maybe they're going to be getting rid of some treasury bonds?
Yeah, it sounds almost like kind of a strategic default then from one system to another, because we have these currency swap deals that China has been setting up for the last number of years, and we have the emerging markets and commodity currencies. With the commodity prices dropping, they can't pay off their dollar-denominated debt because they borrowed too much in dollars, and we have China ready to step in with the new system here and give them, I guess, lower interest rate loans and things like that the U.S. Banking system probably wasn't able to give them.
Yeah, and we haven't even covered we're not planning to, but the emerging market nation debt. So these Western banks have a lot of shit coming down the pike, Jason. Pardon my French, but they're not really talking much about the consequence of RMB inclusion. It's going to be a massive dumping exercise of treasury bonds, and I'm not going to stop there. I believe it's going to have a follow-on effect of these same nations saying, wait a minute, we're not just going to dump treasuries to replace them with RMB Chinese bonds. Let's get some gold too. Let's start doing the right thing and making a stable South Korean banking system. Let's get some gold in here. So it's going to be, I think, a mass exodus out of U.S. Treasury bonds into RMB bonds and gold bullion. So this is a very big deal, and I'll admit that I made a mistake. I made a mistake on this IMF conclusion. I said about 4 or 5 months ago, it was maybe around June and May, I said the IMF made a big mistake. They're playing bully, and they just said no and broke some of the agreements, and the Chinese are really pissed off. So look for some Chinese reaction, and the U.S. and the European bankers and the London bankers are going to do their dead level best to try to keep China out of the room in the special drawing rights room that has the U.S. dollar, the British pound, the European euro, and the Japanese yen. But then we saw the Chinese satisfy the accounting requirements, but more importantly, they sold $250 billion worth of treasury bonds. Wow. So they made their presence known, Jason. And I think what we're seeing here now is I think we're going to see a gold march toward the recapitalization of the Western banking system. Go ahead.
And speaking of gold, we have record demand for physical gold, and physical silver demand is still very strong. But, the paper price it just keeps going down. And, when you look at the chart, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. What happened, the technical chart for the paper price of gold and silver, what happens to gold and silver supply available if many gold and silver mines shut down and mines start going bust? Do you think Wall Street is planning on buying gold and silver mines up as they go bankrupt?
I really don't think so. And I watch one company in order to give me the best indication on that direction. I look at the company that Wall Street has the tightest relationship with, the biggest clause in that mining company's back, and that's Barrick Gold. There was a time when they had a second executive board where it was more like ex-presidents and corrupt narco kings like Papa Bush and Mulroney. They were on the second board. What's Barrick doing with a second board with Bush on it? What are they doing? It's because they're in charge of gold policy, linking up with Wall Street, U.S. government, and take a closer look at some of the contracts that Barrick was involved in. And in the late 1990s, they had what was called the Evergreen contracts. The Evergreen Gold contract allowed the Barrick bigwigs, like members on their executive boards, and their executives in running the company. They sold gold with no legal obligation to deliver on the metal. What the hell is that? That's called official gold suppression in the market under legal terms dictated by these elite mucky-mucks. And only Barrick is involved in that. So I look at Barrick nowadays, and, they got some serious problems. It's not just the Pascua Lama project on the Chile-Argentine border. That's an $8.5 billion sink. Somebody blocked that. And you can say, well, the Chilean government just blocked it. Well, who's behind the Chilean government? What kind of power does Chile government have to stop the Wall Street Barrick juggernaut with their evergreen corruption and blocking an $8 billion Pascua Lama project on environmental violation grounds? What's that all about? Someone's behind Chile. And I think it's China. I think the Chinese said, don't mess with the Chilean government because we got their back. All right. Now, lately, in the last couple of years, we're seeing, especially in recent months, a number of Barrick properties being sold. And it's, again, the Chinese coming in. So I like to look at Barrick as the example, as the model, as the, what's the word?
Barometer.
Pardon me?
Barometer.
Barometer, but also the template. That's it, the template. The template to be followed. I betcha, this is a gut feeling, and it's a little bit astray from the question. I bet China has been taking some interest in the Barrick business and the Barrick properties for two purposes. To try to neutralize this elite linkage with claws in their bank, to learn about their technology for gold mining, but mainly, this is hard to prove, mainly to get rid of the evergreen log jam so the Shanghai Gold Exchange can lift the oil price without the evergreen logs sitting in the way after 18 to 20 years of clogging up the system. We don't have a firm estimate. It's probably a national security issue. What's the estimate of the total evergreen contracts that are screwing up the gold market? Contracts sitting in there suppressing the gold price where there's no delivery of gold. I think the Chinese are trying to buy up the evergreen logs, buy up the Barrick technology, and neutralize the Western elite control. If they took controlling interest, say, of the Federal Reserve, the Chinese, they might have realized shortly afterward, after looking over some of the books, that they needed to control the Barrick corrupt site. And that's what I think is going on. But, okay, a little bit more on the question that you asked. I think we're seeing a parallel movement right now. I'm a little confused. I'm trying to find my notes here. Okay, the Chinese are buying gold and silver properties. Okay, if these mining companies go bust, look what China's been buying in South America and especially in Australia. Australia is basically a mining country, and they've got a little economy on the side that sits on the coastline, while the 90% of the interior is involved in mining via BHP Billiton. BHP, by the way, stands for Broken Hill Products, Broken Hill something, Broken Hill Production, because they were a client of Digital way back in the 80s when I was there. And Broken Hill had not merged at that time with Billiton. Okay, so do you think the Chinese are going to continue with their gold mine acquisitions? Well, sure, and they have been. They're taking minor percentage interests in lots of North American and Canadian, especially Canadian mining companies. So I think the Wall Street banks are going to be told to back off, Jason.
Yeah, because I've seen rumors on the internet that, like, the bankers, they're making so much money shorting the paper, gold, and silver price, and they're buying physical. I've heard from my sources in New York who trade in New York that they buy physical metal with the profits because they know they know that the paper metals price is going to get smashed. But I've also heard other people say that, the plan is to just destroy the paper, gold, and silver markets and then come in and buy up the miners for cheap. But, obviously when you force companies into bankruptcy, there's going to be bidding wars for it, and it looks like China has the most cash to do these bidding wars. I've also heard rumors, you brought up Barrick Gold and China. I've also heard rumors maybe the Chinese use the Chilean government influence there with the environmental stuff, but I've also heard rumors that China wants to go in now and buy up 50% of Pascua-Lama for pennies soon. So I've heard that that's pretty persistent rumor going on now, that they're in negotiations with Barrick to buy up like 40 or 50% interest in Pascua-Lama at a deep, deep discount because Barrick's in such a huge hole.
And wouldn't it be a great surprise if a month later the environmental violations were lifted?
It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Okay, here's two points regarding the U.S. banks. I don't think they need to go in to buy the mines because they're making money in two ways right now. Recall we got the 0%. And notice that every time there are rumors of a rate hike, it doesn't happen. They don't want to destroy the Wall Street bank bond carry trade, where they borrow money basically for free and invest in the 10-year bond, put on 30-to-1 leverage, and they earn 60% a year on that for free with free money. Okay, they're making money with the bond carry trade. Now, if you listen to Ben Fulford, you'll hear that certain parties from the East are trying to stop that. Okay, what's the second big business that the American banks are involved in that are making them big money? It's narcotics money laundering. So, they've got the bond carry trade, which is lazy money, corrupt profit. They've got narco money, which is easy money, and they're not at risk of being caught because they're running the U.S. government. Okay, I think the Chinese have told the Fed which they largely control in secrecy, to tell their satellite Wall Street banks, back off, you're not buying into the mining industry, and this is a very good piece of news. If it's true, and I think it is.
Yeah, I think any token interest rate increases because obviously like the mainstream financial media saying, oh, it's like a 70% probability now the Fed's going to do a token rate hike or a couple of these things. I think, if they actually do them, they're going to backfire tremendously. And there's a lot of people making so much money off this financial repression now at lower rates with bond carry trades and things like that, like you said, that, those people, they have a lot of influence. And also stronger dollar, there's a lot of corporations that don't want a stronger dollar. I'm sure, these large corporations, multinational ones that are U.S.-based, they're going to start bitching to the Federal Reserve if the dollar keeps getting stronger that, you're hurting our earnings. We can't get our stock options and bonuses and things like that. We can't financially engineer the earnings higher if the dollar keeps getting stronger.
Well, they've got these companies, multinational U.S.-based companies, they've got 25, 30 years of business investment outside the U.S. If there is a rate hike, suppose I was invited to be a member of the Federal Reserve Board. I'm not trying to make an arrogant argument or anything. They're not going to. But suppose I was in there and they asked my advice and they were going to, give serious concern to my advice on a rate hike. I would suggest they do a 1/32nd percent, a 32nd of 1% rate hike, just to see what would happen. Not a quarter. A quarter's a lot. That's 25 basis points. No. Let's do a lot less. 1/16 is 6 basis points. Let's do 3 basis points. 1/32nd. Let's see what the reaction is, and let's be willing to reverse it in one day if we see a bad result from some hidden convexity or this or that. No, they're not going to do that, though. I think they're not going to do any rate hike at all. In fact, they might go negative because they're stupid. I've got a phrase that I put in my Hetrick letter for November, and a couple clients commented, there you go again, Jim, that's a quotable. Going to negative percent would be like the banking system breathing through their asshole. They might. They've had their heads up their asses so long, why not breathe through their asshole?
Yeah, these are stupid academic Keynesians. Keynes basically said in general theory interest rates have to keep going lower and lower and lower. The mainstream media won't talk about what Keynes really said in the general theory. He wanted the worse the economy was, the more he wanted all the interest rates brought down. And, some of these academic Keynesians, they say, well, we can go worse than zero. We can start penalizing people for holding any savings at all.
Well, so I think if you look closely at Keynes' work, he believed in liquidation of failed companies. So we're not following Keynes anything. Too big to fail is a violation of Keynesianism.
Well, let's leave Keynes for another interview. For another interview, I had Rob Kirby on the last one, and he went through Keynes' background. He said some interesting things that I already knew, but people on interviews don't discuss those because of all the crazy stuff Keynes was actually into. He was a total hedonist. My next question though is about Wall Street banks starting to rapidly embrace the blockchain technology behind Bitcoin. Is this another part of the elite's plan for a cashless society where all transactions are taxed and tracked?
I like to admit my shortcomings. And, I've been pointed out a couple times with some email that made an incorrect forecast. One recently was, hey, look, we had the Chinese New Year in February, and Shanghai Gold Exchange did not enable a higher gold price. Okay, that's correct. That's something that I said was wrong. It didn't work out that way, but it might be just a delay. All right, when it comes to Bitcoin, Jason, I don't know a lot about it. I decided about 5 months ago that this thing is coming on the scene, and someone wrote me and said, what do you think about the cryptocurrencies? I didn't even know what it was. What is it? I said. Oh, Bitcoin. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know much about it. I decided 5 months ago that I would need a full month of heavy study to come up to speed on what Bitcoin and the cryptos are all about. I don't have that time, and I don't have a staff. No one on my staff is an expert on that. I've been a guest on a couple of interviews with, he called himself Ben Quixote, but it's the BitShare folks. And, I tell them I don't know a lot about these cryptocurrencies. So what we try to do is not so much to dance on the edge. We try to get very involved in in some of their major causes that are linked with the things that I know about, so we discuss them. But when it comes to the big banks embracing Bitcoin and blockchain technology, I don't even know what blockchain is. I think in general, given my suspicions of the banks, I think they've decided that this thing has some critical mass, so they better join it, infiltrate it, alter it, and corrupt it. And now's the time they need to do that. Because if they don't get involved much in it, it might get out of control in its legitimacy. So what I do is I try to think of a parallel. Think of the financial regulatory bill. What was that, 2010? It had really good beginnings. But then it got infiltrated by the big banks and the lobbyists, and before you knew it, what started out as a noble, very noble project got corrupted by Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, who wrote the whole thing. So, join it, infiltrate, alter, and corrupt, just like the financial regulatory bill, otherwise known as Dodd-Frank. I think they're realizing, Jason, that it's reaching critical mass. There are some people that, a couple people on my group of colleagues, they think this could really become the standard for gold-based retail. And I thought for the longest time, until a year ago, that the basis and foundation for gold-based retail was going to be larger platforms having to do with gold trade notes and their purchase with gold backing, and debit cards operating below that platform. But it could be that the blockchain is good. It could be that the BitShare, Bitcoin, I really don't know the differences, so I don't claim to. I don't like to make stuff up and say, well, this is the way it is. No, I don't know. But I'm pretty damn sure that the big banks are worried about it, and they think this has got some critical mass. So they're starting to take some action. I'd like to see the big banks blocked on all cryptocurrencies as a consequence in legal settlement for their bond fraud.
Yeah, Blythe Masters has actually, she went from creating derivatives and credit default swaps and things like that at JP Morgan, and also, I guess, manipulating the paper, gold, and silver markets or helping to. She left, and JP Morgan just gave her, I think, $30 million to start her own blockchain company, and she was on the cover of Bloomberg magazine about, the blockchain and things like that. So it makes me very skeptical as well. I think you're very onto something, that Wall Street is going to look for ways to manipulate the market. I actually had a friend of mine, this is a story I've told to listeners in the past, a friend of mine was at a Bloomberg conference in around the New York area a couple of years ago in 2011, and Gary Gensler was there when he was the head of the CFTC, and he was asked about gold and silver market manipulation after he gave a speech in front of, a lot of famous mainstream financial journalists and billionaire money managers, and he basically just said people nowadays he admitted gold and silver markets are manipulated, and he said people just have to assume that if a market can be manipulated, it will be. So I guess that will be the case with Bitcoin. Wall Street now, since it is a pretty fairly large market of a couple $1 billion at least, there is money to be made there in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions trying to figure out how to manipulate that market.
Well, we're going to see some ring fencing. The legitimate cryptocurrency players like BitShare, they're going to do their dead level best to eliminate the participation of the big banks and to advertise their lack of participation in the process in order to build the client base. If you're going to build a client base, you're going to have to rely on idiots, morons, and total fools to join a JP Morgan cryptocurrency. So they're going to try to work, the J.P. Morgan crowd is probably going to try to work the financial sector, while the innovative originators and developers of cryptocurrency are going to probably do their dead level best to erect large fences and say, no, we don't participate with that. We're not compatible with that because it's out of J.P. Morgan and they're responsible for billions and trillions of bond fraud. So I'd like to see in some of the settlements coming up, there are always new criminal fraud settlements that Wall Street's involved in because there's no end to what they're doing that's criminal. I'd like to see the cryptocurrency crowd get in there with the judge and say, we'd like to be part of the settlement. Okay, it's a deferred prosecution, which means we're not going to prosecute you now. We might later, but they never do. It's not deferral, it's forgiven. Not a deferred prosecution, it's forgiven. It's not going to be prosecuted. They don't admit a felony, no one goes to jail, no executive resigns, sometimes they're fired, forced into whatever. But I'd like to see the cryptocurrencies guy get in there with the judge and say, Wall Street, you cannot be involved in cryptocurrencies as a consequence of your fraud. And I don't think it'll happen, Jason. It should, but it won't.
Well, it's supposed to be open source, so people are supposed to be able to watch it for manipulation, but they're trying to create, private blockchains where they can do this manipulation. So they'll just, since the code is open source, they can copy it and make their own private blockchains with manipulation, things like that. You brought up, fraud. Did you see the news story that just came out recently in Bloomberg? It was that there's now a huge class action lawsuit being filed against a lot of the major Wall Street banks for interest rate swap fixing and manipulation.
No, that's welcome news, and it's a little late. Wasn't that supposed to be 2 years ago with the LIBOR?
This is an additional one. I'll send you the link to that after the interview.
Well, that's fine. I thought that was pretty much a skate that Barclays and the Wall Street banks got for at least $2 trillion liability. Again, they're too big to fail and too big to take action on a $2 trillion liability. So, hey, I welcome this. Maybe it's something they can't escape, or maybe it's something, I hate to say it, but maybe it's something the Chinese will usher along and make sure it doesn't get shoved under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, American people should start to put the pieces to this puzzle together. I mean, the banks have manipulated LIBOR. They've manipulated, currency markets, helped manipulate. They've gotten fined for these. They've gotten so many fines for manipulation of different commodities markets and now interest rate swap fixing and things like that. I mean, all these things together, I mean, people still trust the banks. It's just amazing. I guess people, most Americans, are just totally brainwashed.
Well, I give an example of my brother. My brother was, he's not listening to this. He doesn't listen to anything I do. We were like twins growing up, and now he's doing very well in Chicago with his own little business, a private business. But he likes looking up the New York Times to see what's going on in the financial set, political set. That's all well and good, but it doesn't really translate into knowing what's going on. There's so many different things going on that are just way above people's heads. People need to grasp some of these concepts. They need to grasp what the Ukraine and Syrian war are about. It's about energy supply to Europe. It's about pipelines. They need to grasp what ISIS is all about. It's about U.S.-sponsored terrorism in the Middle East. It's part of Arab Spring. There's so many things going on that people need to get their wits about. And my brother just doesn't know about gold. It's sad. Phi Beta Kappa economics degree in college. And he said, Jim, I didn't have a single course that even mentioned gold. I said, well, John, what the hell did you learn? He said, you had a double major in political science, and you don't even know what fascism is. Well, I know what fascism is. Then why don't you understand that the president is promoting fascism? Well, I just don't see it that way. We've got a bunch of Americans, 90% of them are brain dead. 10% of them I talk to. And that's great. Maybe not all 10%, but I'd like to. I have a nasty, cynical way of looking at things. In the United States, 90% of the people are just blockhead stupid. and it cuts across racial lines, class lines, educational lines, business line, white collar, blue collar. 90% of them are blockheaded stupid. Okay? That's what I've noticed. Doesn't matter if they've got a good degree from a good school, had a good job for 25 years. Doesn't matter. 90% are blockheaded stupid. Just had an argument yesterday with an American about 9/11 at Thanksgiving dinner, and I just said, let's not talk about this anymore, okay? Let's just leave it alone. Okay, of the 10%, only 10% of the 10%, so only 1% are actually doing anything to protect their life savings. So you got 10% are blockheaded stupid, in my opinion, Jason, and I hate to say it, but it's what I think. And of the 10%, 9% are aware but not doing anything about it. Kind of like my brother. Well, you know, I know that the money system in Keynes is not quite right, but I just don't have time to follow all the gold stuff. I used to invest in the mining companies, but I lost some money and I quit, so I'm not doing anything more. Okay, my brother's among the 9% of the 10 who are aware. He's just not doing anything about it. He's lazy. So, of the ones who are not blockheaded stupid, 90% of them are just lazy. Well, I got so much to do, and I got family obligations. I work pretty hard, Jim, and I come back from home, and I don't want to read about depressing stuff. Okay, then don't. But what you're left with, Jason, in my opinion, is 1% of the American population. I'm not talking about 1% being the ones controlling everything, the banker, the 1%. No, I'm talking about 1% of the population actually doing something to protect their life savings. That means 3.3 million people are doing something to protect their life savings, studying avidly, subscribing to the Hat Trick Letter, or other gold-based newsletters that promote what's going on and really increase awareness. Only 1% of the society, but 9% are good potential ones. That's another 27 million people. 28 million people. That could, because they're aware. But 90% of them are lazy. Laziness is a very dangerous human characteristic. Oh, I know what good eating habits are. I know what good exercise habits are. But, hey, I come back, I like my pizza, and I'm 280 pounds now. I let myself go 18 to 20 years ago, but I really know what a good diet is. There are a lot of lazy people who are aware. And that's my little speech about America. I don't think they're all blockheaded stupid. No, just 90%.
Well, we do have a rapidly growing libertarian movement in the United States. I've heard it's estimated at 20 million and growing. But yeah, they may be listening to libertarian stuff and starting to wake up, but they don't trust everything in terms of investing advice in the economy. But they are starting to wake up. We're starting to see a lot of people that don't trust either political party, and then maybe they're starting to look at Ron Paul or your work and at least question what the mainstream narrative is. I have two more questions though before I let you go. They're both about currency swaps. China is negotiating a large currency swap bailout with Venezuela, probably in exchange for a massive amount of oil. Will this be the model, how the developing world, commodity-producing countries with too much dollar-denominated debt will strategically default on their dollar debt, and then gain financing from China and Chinese banks?
I can't think of the acronym for the Venezuelan oil company. I think it's PDVSA. But let's just call it the Venezuelan State Oil Company. The Venezuelan oil company is basically ruined. Chavez for 20 years put cronies in there at top engineering spots, had a lot of thefts of their treasury, had a lot of sweetheart loans, and the result was they had, after just 5 or 6 years of Chavez in charge, influencing PDVSA, they had about a 20 or 25% reduction in output. Okay. I think China is getting involved here to try to guarantee a couple things. they realize Venezuela is a basket case. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's Maduro, which means mature, President Maduro, I don't know that he was responsible, but one of his main opposition leaders in the campaign was just shot to death yesterday. I mean, how would it be if, we got this presidential campaign and one of the American candidates was shot to death? I mean, it would cause an uproar. But this is kind of standard fare in some Latin American countries. And it might have been Langley who killed him, because Langley killed one of the Brazilian presidential candidates. And I've got Brazilian clients who tell me they killed more than one Brazilian presidential candidate over the last 15 years. So I think China is trying to line up some guaranteed oil supply. That's one thing. I think they're trying to line up a naval base in Venezuela. Remember the Nicaraguan canal deal? The only thing that's really made progress is the Chinese naval bases. I don't think the canal will be ever built, but I think the Chinese naval bases will be. Okay, China wants a presence in the I don't know what you call the Atlantic coastline of North America. I'm sorry, South America. The northern coast of South America. It's the Colombian, Venezuelan, and in Guyana. But Guyana's just a wasteland. It's just a forest. It's a jungle with totally undeveloped. There might be some mining interest in there. All right, so China wants a military base. China wants some guarantee of the oil supply. China's already got something like a $17 billion swap agreement with Venezuela to lock in imports, exports, and make sure that they can sell some Chinese goods to Venezuela in return for some Chinese oil, Chinese gasoline. I'm sorry. For Venezuelan oil, Venezuelan gasoline, and Venezuelan diesel. So it's the oil and the oil products, the fuels. China wants them. Okay, that's great. That's great. Fine for China. If it becomes larger volume, 17 billion is kind of peanuts. In the go-go days, several years ago, China was accumulating $20 to $23 billion worth of treasury bonds every single month. So if they got $17 billion for a yuan swap agreement between China and Venezuela, that's kind of small. Let's see if it becomes a much bigger deal where, say, China buys, I'm just making this up, it could happen. Remember I was talking about China buying the infrastructure, the business capital behind the energy industries. Wouldn't it be interesting if China says, we'd like to make a $20 billion investment stake in PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, for your equipment, for your petrochemical processing plants, because Venezuela's got what they call heavy oil. It's not only thick, but it's also heavy in contaminants. So they have to do a lot of processing before they ship it as final crude oil that heads off to some refineries. There's something else, I think, in addition to military bases, in addition to maybe business capital investment in the Venezuelan energy business, their company. I think there's something else that China would like to do. I think they'd like to get some control over the Venezuelan state oil company business operations. They might want to put in some of their own hand-picked people and boot out the Chavez clowns that have corrupted it. So they might have some deal working in the next year or so with Venezuela. We'd like to invest, but we'd also like a say and a voice for some of the positions. Now, maybe I'm just dreaming, but China is really getting aggressive in a lot of different aspects of business. They're starting up businesses, hundreds of them, in the United States in free trade zones that have state sponsorship in almost all 50 states. I think they're going to start to get involved, not so much in free trade zones in foreign countries. I think they're going to start to get involved in the energy industries there, all across the world. Well, we'll see. We'll see. It would be an interesting development, but wouldn't it be a boon for, say, the Chinese graduates in their engineering schools who are bilingual in English or Spanish to get placed in the Venezuelan state oil company? I mean, they're going to start exporting their college graduates and their university specialists. Just a matter of time. But we'll see. Again, I think this is going to become, Jason, a real big example of more volume of indirect exchange dumping U.S. treasuries for a tangible purpose. And the tangible purpose could be for buying oil, buying diesel and gasoline, but also investing in maybe some of the Venezuelan economy. They might say, we'd like to do an investment. We'd like to buy 3 or 4 of your major companies in Venezuela. Not necessarily the state oil company, but I think their target is going to be the state oil company. They want to lock in their oil supply. And I think at the same time, they would just smile from ear to ear, knowing that they could block some of the export of Venezuelan oil to the United States.
Yeah, I think, Jim, that Venezuela also has a lot of undeveloped gold mines, too. There was a lawsuit there. The government confiscated the assets of a gold mining company, and then the gold mining company tried suing them in international court to get some of their money back. But there's a lot of other minerals and things like that, like copper and gold and things like that there, too. So I'm sure China would be interested in that if they could buy it for cheap, considering how dire straits Venezuela is. You heard about how much a 12-pack of condoms in Venezuela costs on the black market, right?
No, I haven't.
It's $700 American for a 12-pack.
Well, I'm surprised there's not a black market taking some of the Costa Rican supply, because we got lots and lots of condoms down here.
Oh, it's I'm sure there is, but there's big crimes for that. So it's basically like a felony in Venezuela to smuggle anything in. So you're risking, your life and jail time and things like that to smuggle in baby food and condoms and things like that. So there's pictures. Our listeners can go and Google this or check on Twitter. There's pictures of like guys smuggling in powdered baby food, like taped all of their body, right? And, make a big profit on the black market and try to get people, babies, food and things like that. But, the guy's like risking his life just smuggling that into Venezuela.
Yeah. Well, let me just make a comment, a little asterisk comment. In Costa Rica, the primary brand, in Spanish is marca, the main brand for condoms is from Thailand. It's not Trojan, not American, not French. You do see some German Baron. I see Trojan, but there are a lot fewer Trojans than there ever were 10 years ago here. And the main one is from Thailand, Durex. So that's just a little side comment. I like to look at a lot of different things on the economy. I don't just follow the brands for condoms. I notice that I do some strange things on my days off. I say, I'm going to take a bike ride. It's about 6 miles. I'm going to go out to that mall. I'm just going to cruise around, have lunch, and come home. And what I do is I look to see how many shuttered locales, they call them, shuttered little shops there are. Liquidation sales. First is liquidation sale, then it's shut down. And you got basically an empty little shop. And they put paper on the front, and they say alquila, means for rent. And what I've heard from a well-informed gringo, this is several years ago, one of the tricks from the gringos here is to buy or rent a shop in a mall for the unexpressed purpose of losing some money. It's okay. They'll only be losing about $800 to $1,200 a month. Okay, they're trying to sell something. Who cares what it is, whether it's, leather goods or shoes or clothing or whatever. My joke is here, oh gosh, another clothing shop? Oh gosh, another shoe shop? No, there's so many. They don't last long. But it's a front to lose money, do some remodeling that might cost, $2,200, but they're going to call it $22,000. And the $22,000 tax deduction. What's that worth in the U.S. tax structure? About $7,000. Okay, so, and then they go out of business in a year. They lost a lot of money. They had a huge tax write-off, and it was a very profitable venture when you add everything up. And there's one mall here. It's called Terra Mall. It's east of town. It's very nice. It's got a modern, great theater with not exactly IMAX, but it's got some extra advantages to the theater. And I go there once a year or so. And I was told by this guy, Jim, look around you. 1/4 of these are owned by Americans just to lose money as tax write-offs in a black hole. That's pretty significant. If a niche in the Costa Rican economy is set up by gringos to lose money, of course they employ someone to sell the leather goods and someone to be at the cash register and someone to be the night watchman, whatever. Okay, so part of the Costa Rican economy is for little shell companies to lose money and create a little tax black hole. That's kind of pathetic.
Well, this is the dystopia we live in now because, there's so many different governments, although the U.S. is one of the worst ones, all trying to figure out new ways to increase taxes and wanting, more control over looking into people's finances and things like that.
Yeah, yep, no doubt.
Well, my final question for you, Jim, has to do with currency swaps. We see them a lot in the news. Do you think currency swaps will be the main bailout tool for central banks going forward?
It could be. I honestly don't know a whole lot about it, but when you brought it up, I did some little thinking and just, laid down and took some notes for this interview and thought about this last question. If they're doing discounts on currency swaps, it sounds to me like they're trying to do a liquidation of currency swaps. Why would they sell them at a discount unless they thought they were worth less? Not worthless, but worth less. So maybe the currency swap will be some kind of a lubricant tool to do a transition away from the current dollar toward the new Scheisse dollar, as I call it. The phase out of the domestic dollar and the movement toward a new domestic-only dollar that I call the Scheisse dollar. Scheisse is German for excrement, flotsam, jetsam, garbage, rubbish. Okay, I call it the U.S. rubbish dollar because I believe it's going to be coming. I thought it would be maybe in the news by now. Earlier this year, I thought by the end of the year it's going to be in the news, but it hasn't. The delays are unbelievably long. But the new Scheisse dollar, I think, is going to be launched so that it's independent of the international U.S. dollar. And it's going to involve devaluation, like 30% immediately. The Chinese have demanded this. And it's going to be motivated by the fact that foreign producers are going to reject the dollar and say, we don't want your stinking dollar. It's worthless. It's not worth anything. You're printing it at the Federal Reserve and shoving it into your banks, covering your bad debts, and that's illegitimate and unethical. So the foreign producers are going to say, we want you to come up with your own dollar and devalue it so that it's real. And maybe we'll finance some of your government debt if you discount your currency, and that's how you get a currency crisis in the United States. But it's not well known how the U.S. would go from the current dollar, which has international implications as well. It's the standard for trade settlement. It's the standard for global reserves sitting in banking systems like in South Korea. They have treasury bonds there. It's their foundation. But it's also the legal tender used in the United States. It's not clear what the transition would be for the U.S. dollar to a new Scheisse dollar that's devalued and used only for domestic purposes and used to pay for imports into the domestic U.S. economy. It's not clear how the transition would take place. Maybe it requires discounting of the current dollar. So when you brought that up, a light bulb went on in my head. Maybe this is how we get a transition. I don't know.
Yeah,
Why, Jason? Why would they sell it at a discount if they think that something's not worth less?
Well, they can't find buyers if they're selling it at a discount. You're referring to you're referring to the article I sent you from Bloomberg about discounted interest rate swaps. How the Wall Street banks that sell these things can't find buyers at current prices, so they're desperate to attract new business and they're willing to offer some type of discount to sell more interest rate swaps. Yeah.
Well, there you go. That's a different road, but it's parallel. That would indicate that we're about to get a debt default in the U.S. Treasuries, and they're trying to discount the U.S. Treasuries in an alternative market because they're going to be worth a lot less. They're supported by QE, but maybe QE won't last forever, so we need a transition to manage the liquidation of the Treasury bond. And that's done with perhaps an interest rate swap. It's not clear at all. The interest rate swap has been an abused instrument that takes the 0% money and produces an artificial demand for a long-term Treasury bond. I don't know how this transition is going to take place, Jason, but we're going to see the end of the U.S. dollar for domestic purposes. We're going to see an end of the Treasury bond because it's broken. You got fractures all over the place. It's not going to 20 years from now, we're not going to have this same U.S. Treasury bond. We're not going to have a U.S. dollar used in, commerce from North Carolina to Pennsylvania. So it's going to be interesting. I don't know how they're going to manage the transition, but it could be that some real whiz-kid finance experts that said, well, let's do a discount on currency swaps and do a discount on interest rate swaps and see if we can get a transition for all the current load of toxic dollars and toxic Treasury bonds. They're not going to survive. QE is a guaranteed death sentence.
Yeah, it just makes the problem worse and it devalues the currency. So, it makes things look, because it keeps the asset markets all propped up, and it makes things look a lot better than they are. But currency swaps are just from one central bank to another. My theory, Jim, is that we have the developed world. So we have like the U.S., Japan, England, the United Kingdom, Europe, Western Europe, the EU. We have these guys all together doing currency swaps with each other to protect their currencies and exchange rates, to protect their banks, to prop up their asset markets. And then we have another group, like the Chinese-led group, the G20 or the BRICS, the other developing countries there. We have them doing currency swaps with each other mostly to transition to the next system. So I guess you could call it, Jim Rickards calls it the currency wars. We can maybe call it the currency swap wars, where we have one group doing the currency swaps to protect the current status quo of the current system, and then we have another group doing currency swaps with each other to set up the new one. So that's kind of how I view things going on right now with the currency swaps.
Okay, well, that's a little deeper than what I addressed, and let me comment on that because I got some thoughts that might make some sense. I was told about 2 years ago, by Cato. Cato is one of my sources, and he's the source from deep inside the U.S. government. He knows things that are going on with the Pentagon. He knows things that are going on with the National Security Agency types, Homeland Security. He actually sits on Homeland Security Board. Once in a while, he'll make a trip to Washington and say, I got back. Craziest bunch of bastards you'd ever want to see, Jim. Anyway, he tells me what happened. But what he told me 2 years ago was that this is back in 2013, that there was a significant amount of central bank to central bank movement of dollars where they were selling Treasury bonds to the Fed at a discount of 30 to 35%. This has been going on since 2013. They're trying to get rid of their reserves within their banking system. And bear in mind, this is a year after QE started. I call QE a death sentence for the dollar. But what it does is it alerts all the foreign nations to get out of the dollar because we're corrupting it, undermining it, debauching it. QE is toxic. It's not stimulus. Kills capital and it leaves all the nations of the world to get rid of their dollars. So it puts the U.S. system totally dependent on the printing press. We are Weimar. We are Weimar right now. As for the G20 dumps, I think this is the G20 nations getting together, doing the same thing, dumping their treasuries, and not just dumping them at a discount to the Fed, but using them to, say, buy a Nigerian oil deposit. Buy it, use it to create a Nigerian port facility. Spend it, in other words.
This is so complicated. So many things going on behind the scenes. I mean, we may never find out the truth. You know, even if there's a total systemic collapse like in 2008 or worse, we may never actually find out all the truth. You know, we do have these stupid biographies coming out from Ben Bernanke and others, though, trying to, you know, steer our direction towards what they want to tell, the partial truths and lies and things, misinformation.
Let's learn about Ben Bernanke and all the things he wanted to do but didn't.
Right.
But, you know, take a look at World War II. It was 70 years ago, Jason. Do we really have definitive historical treatments of what happened? And did the historical treatments mention Operation Paperclip? Did they mention that Hitler escaped to Argentina to live out his life? Did it mention that Hitler went to Hawaii once a year for birthday parties with all of his buddies? No, the historical treatments are not historical treatments. They're more layering by the victors. Oh gosh, the voice has got some experience in Middle East and Africa, and he's got a quote about lions. It goes something like, "You're never going to glorify the lion unless the lion eats and kills all the hunters." The lion is never glorified unless he eats all the hunters. To the victor go the spoils and the opportunity to write the history books. So,
well, Jim,
who writes World War II history books?
The U.S. government?
Yeah, the victors.
Yep.
So all the scummy crap that they did, they don't talk about. It comes out later. Later, we hear about Operation Paperclip, where several hundred, if not 1,000 Nazis entered the U.S. government, banking system, and industry, including Joseph Mengele. He went straight to Langley, where Walt Disney had a contract with the CIA.
Wow. Yeah, another thing is, you know, Jeb Bush, the Republican presidential candidate, he was asked the question if he would go back and kill baby Hitler, but, you know, then I guess people weren't aware of the history that his grandfather, Prescott Bush, was involved doing a lot of he was a former Wall Street guy. The grandfather was doing, you know, big business deals with the Nazis and things like that, and I think he was also involved in trying to, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution and trying to set up a central bank there. So, I mean, the people who ask these talking heads these questions, I mean, they don't really understand history.
No, they don't understand history. They don't even want to know that Prescott Bush, the father of Papa Bush, the grandfather of Jeb and baby George the moron, they don't want to know that Prescott Bush was caught in a coup attempt of Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt decided, no, I don't want to earn the wrath and vengeance of all Prescott Bush's friends that remain in the government. So I'm going to give him a pass for a failed coup, which was treason and sedition. And I'm going to give him a spot in the Central Intelligence Agency, which is so new and so young that no one gives a crap about it. And his son became the biggest narcotics dealer in world history, worth over $5 trillion.
Nothing surprises me anymore with all these stories. I mean, like, we still haven't, the government still hasn't released, like, all the information from the Kennedy assassination. It keeps delaying it, so it's all a bunch of BS. There was a leak not a leak. There was a whistleblower story supposedly about how the head of the CIA lied about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, that was over 50 years ago, and we're probably still never going to find out the truth.
No, they'll wait, to the point where nobody really cares. It doesn't matter. We got a new crisis. We're going to be waiting for the revelation of what happened on 9/11 and how Israel was way behind that. No, we don't find out what's going on. We just move from crisis to crisis. But I think we're going to lose our country. I think we're going to lose the United States. The Chinese are already in control of the Federal Reserve. The Chinese already control most of the West Coast port facilities. The Chinese own 30% of almost every major city's commercial buildings in the United States. So we're well along to losing our country. And I give the challenge, and I drop the gauntlet to China. Please reindustrialize the United States, because the Rockefeller Foundation suggested that we outsource our industry in the 80s and 90s, and we did so, but we ruined our country.
Well, unfortunately, Jim, I think any industrialization, we're starting to see evidence of this now, because politicians are trying to force wages too high that small business owners can't pay. We're going to see robots and automation. So any industrialization might mean rapid loss of jobs even further. I've seen some studies saying that 40-50% of all jobs in the next 2 decades could be lost in the United States due to automation and robotics.
Well, that could be. I think we've been saying that for a long time, and this equipment you're referring to is extremely expensive and not all that easy to operate. So I don't think it's going to have as much traction as you might, but I think the Chinese already are reindustrializing the United States. I did something, I think it was a September newsletter for the Hat Trick Letter. I took a chart that I found, a client gave me, and all you had to do was say, touch your arrow from your mouse on Pennsylvania, and there was a list of 40 companies doing business in Pennsylvania as free trade zones sponsored by the Pennsylvania government, and almost all of them were Chinese. Every state had a long list of free trade zone businesses. Almost all of them were Chinese. So I think we've got a lot of progress. I look when you make your point, I think, well, sure. I don't remember the last time when a guy actually came out to the gas pump and pumped in 12 gallons into my tank. I did it myself by running the credit card. So that machine took someone out of a job. Okay, well, that's fine. And the U.S. always likes to say, yeah, but the jobs just shift. Instead of a guy pumping your gas, you have a whole organization making those machines. Well, that's true, except they're usually done in Taiwan. We exported that, remember? So, I look to see about the export of jobs more than I do the automation of jobs and the loss of the lower level income. It's usually exported, where the good, rosy jobs of designing and manufacturing those gas pumps is not in the United States. Labor's cheaper elsewhere, and I always point out Taiwan. Taiwan is it's a real miracle spot. They got so much patents there, patent ownership. It's an amazing little country.
Well, Jim, I just want to thank you again for your time today. I had a great discussion. Please tell listeners where they can find the Hat Trick Letter and your other work.
Well, it's real simple. It's www.goldenjackass.com. And in business now 11 and a half years. Still enjoying it. It's a labor of love. It's getting to be it's changing. Honestly, Jason, it's changing. We're really not getting more solutions. So every month it has to be a certain challenge to get motivated. And I do. But it used to be, well, we're going to get a lot of progress toward goal. But no, now we're looking at maybe the prospect on the corrupt comics market of 1,000. And people are getting discouraged. So there's a lot of discouragement as we work toward the climax. Anyway, it's www.goldenjackass.com. And I offer in the Hat Trick Letter, which is found there, a lot of encouragement. because I produce lots and lots of stories. They're not my own. Some are, but I take stories that are emanating out of Asia and Europe that the United States doesn't pay attention to. The United States doesn't pay attention to about 60 to 70% of the interesting stories that happen. They're not properly getting the IMF inclusion of RMB right. They're not talking about it correctly at all. But I talk about the in-depth of what it means, what's likely to happen. So the hat-trick letter offers a lot of hope and encouragement and motivation for staying the course and continuing to invest in gold and silver bars and coins, and to continue getting out of the paper investments like bank certificates, stocks, mutual funds, bonds, annuities. Get out of them. Pay the taxes, invest in silver. Get out of your stocks, which they're propping up. Sell high, thank them, and buy low the gold and silver, which they're keeping down. And when you buy it, thank them again. I tell you, isn't it the key to investing to sell high and to buy low? Sell when it's higher than real value and buy when it's lower than real value. Do it. Get rid of your stocks. Get rid of your bank CDs. I think there's going to be a slash coming to the bank CDs in the next couple of years where people are just told, sorry, you got a $10,000 CD, but we can only give you $7,000 on that because of the rules that the U.S. government has dictated. It's going to be part of the devaluation and the introduction of the new Scheist dollar. It's going to involve devaluations of your bank CD. So anyway, on goldenjackass.com, www.goldenjackass.com, no hyphens in there, you'll find a lot of free material. Interviews like this, I always ask the hosts, sure, but you got to give me a link so that the subscribers and the followers for Hat-Trick Letter and my work can listen to the interview, and that's how I do it. But I occasionally come out with a public article. I wrote one yesterday in the morning of Thanksgiving, and because there's not much to do, I had my work done, and I wasn't due for the Thanksgiving dinner until 2 p.m., so in the morning I wrote a public article, the first one in a little while here, I think a couple months, but the title was Triggers for U.S. Dollar Collapse, and movement for the crude oil down to $30 is one. I think it's going to cause tremendous problems in a chain reaction. Another one is emerging market debt is going to start to default. It's going to cause a chain reaction and enormous problems. Okay, so we have a number of triggers, and the link for that article is also on my website on the free page. But, look around at the free information. I always tell them, Jason, and sign up for the newsletter. And lately I've been mentioning the two main compliments that I got. And I just got a fellow subscribe last week and said, Jim, I've been reading first it was the October report, now I read some of the November report, and I'm like those other people you mentioned. I'd follow your work for the last couple of years, year and a half, on your radio interviews, and I hesitated to sign up. And I wish I'd signed up earlier. You got a lot of great stuff in there. It's a lot to read, but I don't have to read it all in 1 hour. I read it piecemeal, and you tie things together really well. Okay, that's one comment I get. I wish I'd signed up earlier. And the other one is people who they signed up before Lehman in 2006, and then in 2010 they just got tired of nothing getting fixed, so they had 4 years with the Hat-Trick Letter. They just signed up again. They said, I missed you. No, not my personality and warmth. They missed the work. They missed. Say, I've been reading a number of different other works and websites, and I thought I'd come back to the Hat-Trick Letter. I'm glad I did, because you got some really great stuff the last couple of months. So those are the two big compliments I'd love to see. And it's been 11 and a half years, Jason, and I really didn't think it was going to go this long. But it is, it does, and it's going to continue a while because U.S. is going to do every single thing it can to extend the King Dollar reign of terror. But now we're getting unmasked. ISIS is being seen internationally now more by people as being an American and Western tool for terror export. Our main exports, by the way, are toxic bonds, diabetes, genetically modified food seeds,